All right, my name is Varoujan Avedikian. I'm a practicing lawyer here in Armenia. Also, I teach here at the AUA. And it's really my great pleasure to be here with you this morning and to present our panelists. When I left my house this morning, I put on my dictator hat to make sure that I'll keep the time and keep us moving within this panel so that we'll be able to participate in the recognition ceremony and to keep this whole process moving. So I'll quickly present our panelists for today, for this session. And I'll start with Baruch Martirosian, who is from Stepanakert. He is an aspiring lawyer, he's going to become a lawyer soon, 4th grade, right, at the Law School of Artsakh State University. And he's also a member of the Student Council and the head of Committee of Legal Affairs. And he is a student of the Center for Truth and Justice. He joined as a volunteer and a student and is doing a very important work. The second speaker is Astghik Babayan, also from Artsakh, who's also a student at the Artsakh State University, another law student. And she's also the chairwoman of Student Council of the Faculty of History of Law and Law. And she's also a student at CFTJ. The third speaker will join us from California, and that's a Ph.D. candidate, Arpi Melikyan, who is studying, excuse me, at the Department of French and Francophone Studies. She has a BA in French and Spanish minor from University of California, Los Angeles. And she was also awarded the Martin Turil Memorial Best Essay Award in French and Francophone Studies. She'll be joining us via Zoom. And the last but not least speaker of our panel today is Professor Elke Hechner, who's with us. Dr. Heckner is a scholar of the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide at the University of Iowa, and is currently completing a book manuscript entitled Thinking Memories of Maturity, Holocaust and the Armenian Genocide. The book focuses on recent paradigm shifts in second and third generation memories of genocide. Starting in the fall this year, she will serve as the director of the Humanities Lab in Global Memory Studies in the Division of World Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at University of Iowa. In addition to teaching courses in witnessing genocide, war crimes trials, conflict resolution as they pertain to the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust, Dr. Heckner has published on visual culture and genocide, especially on second and third generation witnessing and post-memory in film and memorial architecture. So I invite you all to welcome our panelists for today. Thank them for being with us. And today's panel is a very important one because it's about storytelling. So without any further ado, I'll invite Paruyr to start off our panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Շնորհակալություն բոլորին. Նախ թույլ տվեք ողջունել մարդու իրավունքներ եւ պատասխանատվություն միջազգային համաժողովի բոլոր մասնակիցներին եւ շնորհակալություն հայտնել ճշմարտության եւ արդարության կենտրոն կազմակերպությանը, որ որպես փաստահավաք դասընթացի շրջանավարտ ինձ հրավիրեց եւ այսօր ես զեկույցով հանդես եմ գալիս այս համաժողովին։ Ինչպես գիտեք, հարգելի գործընկերներ, 2020 թվականի սեպտեմբերի 27-ին Ադրբեջանի զինված ուժերը լայնածավալ զինված հարձակում էին սկսել Արցախի հանրապետության, Լեռնային Ղարաբաղի հանրապետության դեմ։ Ադրբեջանի զինված ուժերը թիրախավորել էին քաղաքացիական օբյեկտները եւ այդ թիրախավորումը եղել է դիտավորյալ, միտումնավոր եւ չտարբերակված։ Ադրբեջանի զինված ուժերի կողմից ռմբակոծվել են բնակելի տներ, հիվանդանոցներ, ներառյալ ծննդատունը եւ վտանգի տակ են դրել քաղաքացիական բնակչության, այդ թվում կանանց, երեխաների, տարեցների կյանքը եւ առողջությունը։ Ավելին, այդ հարձակումները այլ թիրախավորումներից չէին տարբերակվել եւ ներառել էին օդուժի, հրթիռների, հրետանու, հարվածային անօդաչու թռչող սարքերի եւ նույնիսկ միջազգայինորեն արգելված զենքերի եւ մեթոդների լայն կիրառում։ Քաղաքացիական օբյեկտների դեմ բարձր ճշգրտության զենքերի կիրառումը վկայում էին այդպիսի հարձակումների միտումնավոր լինելու մասին։ Օրինակ, հոկտեմբերի 28-ին ավելի քան 15 անգամ հրթիռակոծվել է Արցախի հանրապետության մայրաքաղաք Ստեփանակերտը, քաղաք Շուշին եւ դիտավորյալ թիրախավորվել է Մոր եւ Մանկան առողջության պահպանման կենտրոնը, հանրապետական հիվանդանոցը, Ստեփանակերտի եւ Շուշիի հանրային նշանակության օբյեկտներ, ծննդատունը եւ մի շարք այլ քաղաքացիական օբյեկտներ։ Ընդ որում, ծննդատան եւ հիվանդանոցների մոտ ռազմական որևէ օբյեկտ տեղակայված չէր։ Հիվանդանոցում կային երեխաներ, այդ թվում նաեւ վիրավորում ստացած անձինք, ովքեր ստացել էին լուրջ հոգեբանական տրավմաներ։ Անդրադառնալով իմ գործնեությանը ճշմարտության եւ արդարության կենտրոնում փաստահավաք գործնեություն իրականացնելով, հանդիպել եմ բազմաթիվ վկաների, որոնք փաստել են այդպիսի ռազմական հանցագործությունները, որոնք տեղի են ունեցել, եւ վկաներից մեկը, ով աշխատում էր հիվանդանոցի անհետաձգելի բուժօգնության բաժանմունքում, նշեց, որ օրեկան ինքը շփվում էր 150-ից 200 վիրավորի հետ եւ այդ վիրավորների շարքում կային նաեւ քաղաքացիական անձինք։ Այդ բժիշկը նշեց, որ հիվանդանոցում գտնվում էին նաև երեխաներ եւ մարդիկ ունեին տարբեր վիրավորումներ, սկսած գնդակային, բեկորային, ծանր արկերի ու հակատանկերից ստացած վիրավորումներ, ինչպես նաև անդամատումներով, այրվածքներ ու կտրվածքներ ունեցող վիրավորներ։ Հիմնականում գանգուղեղային եւ որովայնային վիրավորումներ էին։ Վկան նաև նշել է արգելված զինատեսակների մասին, մասնավորապես ֆոսֆորային եւ կասետային ռումբերի զինատեսակների կողմից ստացված վիրավորում ունեցող մարդկանց մասին։ Վկան հիշում է, որ ռենտգենի միջոցով կարողացավ իմանալ, որ մի վիրավոր անձ ունի իր մարմնում 127 բեկոր։ Այս ագրեսիայի պատճառով արձանագրված իրավախախտումները դրդել են ինձ այս զեկույցը պատրաստել եւ միջազգային հանրության ուշադրությունը հրավիրել այս հարցի շուրջ, քանի որ չենթարկելով պատասխանատվության ռազմական հանցագործությունների, պատերազմի եւ խաղաղության մարդկության դեմ ուղղված հանցագործությունների տեսանկյունից, եթե մենք պատասխանատվության չենթարկենք համապատասխան սուբյեկտներին, ապա այդ ռազմական հանցագործությունները շարունակական բնույթ կկրեն։ Միջազգային իրավունքի համաձայն խստիվ արգելվում է քաղաքացիական բնակչության, առանձին քաղաքացիական անձանց եւ քաղաքացիական օբյեկտների վրա հարձակումը կամ թիրախավորումը։ Այս գործողությունները համարվում են ռազմական հանցագործություններ, քաղաքացիական անձիկ դառնում են օրինական թիրախ, բացառապես այն դեպքում, երբ ուղղակիորեն մասնակցում են ռազմական գործողություններին։ Եվ այդ հարաբերությունները կարգավորում է միջազգային մարդասիրական իրավունքով, Ժնևի կոնվենցիայով եւ ժամանակը խնայելու համար չեմ անդրադառնում մի շարք միջազգային իրավական կարգավորումներին եւ ընդհանրացնելով կարող ենք նշել, որ գործող միջազգային իրավունքի հիման վրա վերլուծելով արձանագրված իրադարձությունները եւ խախտումները պարզ է դառնում, որ դրանցից գոնե հարձակումները հիվանդանոցի դեմ արդեն կատարվել են Ադրբեջանի զունիժի կողմից ռազմական հակամարտության ընթացքում։ Շնորհակալություն։
Thank you so much. Today my topic is Azerbaijan's false propaganda during the Third Artsakh War and in the post-war period. It testifies the international experience that the influence of information flows for carrying military operations against enemy may be a powerful weapon in the hands of the nations, and the nations that haven't potential to resist to those forces can have serious problems. The purpose of such information psychological pressures is to mislead the addressee to one degree or another. Such actions can lead to the split and disintegration of the enemy forces. Before the Third Artsakh War, during the war, and after the war, enemy didn't stop carrying out actions aimed at creating a field of tension among Armenian population and presents to the international community materials that are completely contrary to the reality, and they often coincide to the nature and context of the violations committed by him. False propaganda actively distorts the real picture of events. False propaganda is a set of regular actions used to spread ideas and teachings in a variety of ways. It pursues political, religious goals, tries to orient the targeted people and to change them. During war, propaganda is used to curse the enemy and incite hatred by controlling its public perception. The Armenian people in 2020, on September 27, faced a new war, while the problems created by previous wars hadn't been yet resolved. Enemy's propaganda machine was constantly active, spreading misconceptions the international community about the military policy of the Armenian side. The Azeri propaganda starting to become active in the 19th of September, when after the president of Azerbaijan Aliyev's interview, when he met with the prime minister of Armenia and accused him of various provocations to escalate the Karabakh conflict. Before their meeting, there was a statement where they say, Azerbaijan side say that soldier Mamedov Elshan Alioğlu was killed by Armenian ballet, and this news was spread in the Azerbaijani media, while the opponent is usually silent about the losses. It's very interesting statement from Aliyev. He says that despite the fact that they are shelling our ancient historical city Ganja, we haven't fired on the cities of either Armenia or Nagorno-Karabakh. In numerous testimonies collected by the Center for Trust and Justice, there are people who suffered from the war, and they tell why their ancient towns and villages were shelled. There is also information from Azerbaijan that Azerbaijan regularly spreads false information about the involvement of Kurdish Syrian militants in the Artsakh Defense Army. Egyptian media reported that the militants of the Kurdistan Workers' Party crossed the territory of Iran, moving from Syria to Armenia. Azerbaijan websites published an article titled "Syrian Terrorists in the Armenian Occupation Forces" as evidence, posting a photograph which was actually a gathering of the Nobarozanian Armenian Brigade in Syria in 2019 on the anniversary of Armenian genocide. There are many testimonies collected by the Center for Trust and Justice, also proves that the Third Artsakh War was carried out by the clearly organized false propaganda activities by the enemy. For example, in many videos, there are many captives that say express what the enemy forces them under the threat of violence. In one of the testimonies, the narrator mentions that his brother is in captivity. In his video shown to us, the captivity said that they are ready to live side by side with the enemy, and that was the case for 40 years. But even from the facial expression of captivities, it's evident that their words are not right. False propaganda is a main phenomenon, the active implementation of which hinders the realization of Armenian people's rights. He accused of violating international norms and principles he feels to need to protect. He accused of actions he himself has fallen victim. Thanks so much. That's all.
So much, Astghik. And now we will have Arpi Melikyan connecting from California via Zoom.
Okay, all right. Greetings, everyone. Before I begin, I would like to thank the Center for Truth and Justice for giving me the opportunity to partake in such a wonderful conference. To be speaking amongst such highly acclaimed professionals and enthusiastic activists is truly an honor. Today, I will be presenting a paper which finds inspiration from the research I'm conducting as a doctoral student. Currently, I'm examining fictional works of literature which contain autobiographical elements, and I'm particularly interested in the notion that although fictional works bear on the imaginative, they can, however, for many productive reasons, be considered as a testimony to traumatic historical events. The paper I am presenting is entitled The Varoujan, a philosophical meditation on displacement, exile, and survival. When men and women are forced to endure terrible things at the hands of others, whenever that extremity involves moral issues, the need to remember becomes a general response. Spontaneously, they make it their business to record the evil forced upon them. Here and in similar situations, survival and bearing witness become reciprocal acts, end quote. Literary critic and educator Shoshana Feldman and psychoanalyst and psychiatric educator Dori Laub begin their co-authored book, Testimony, Crises of Witnessing in Literature, Psychoanalysis, and History with the aforementioned epigraph, written by the Holocaust scholar Terence Deprez. Published in 1992, this foundational text on testimony and witnessing with its groundbreaking theoretical findings on listening to trauma remains an important work to consider when thinking about our implications in contemporary world events. Yes, it is indeed our business and our moral imperative to record any evil imposed upon innocent men and women. I believe that CFTJ's endeavors in archiving testimonies from survivors of the 2020 Artsakh War and our active participation in today's conference form an integral part in bearing witness to one of the most tragic events in Armenian history. As a doctoral student researching in the field of memory and trauma studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, over the course of the war in these 2 years, I began to reflect more deeply upon how my field is engaged with the real world, and if in fact it can play an invaluable role in political discourse. Since my expertise is consigned to literature, I became unsettled by the idea that I could read and discuss historical catastrophes, and in particular the violence that continues to take place in Artsakh, but remain unheard by those who have the power to foster political change. I believe that when considering literature as a critical paradigm where knowledge can be born discursively, it can indeed provide a space in which experiences can be humanized and where the unspeakable can be articulated. Having the opportunity to partake in the conference has opened the possibility of presenting a fascinating yet underexplored work of literature by the Franco-Armenian writer Nikos Sarafyan, a text which, in my opinion, unfortunately finds relevance in today's conversation and resonates with the preoccupations of present-day Armenians living around the world. Reading and discussing Sarafyan in conjunction with Feldman and Laub has brought forth productive insights into the way we think about the concept of testimony and the emotional, physical, and psychological repercussions of displacement, survival, and trauma. In presenting my reading of Sarafyan's work, I hope that we can continue to reflect upon some of the pressing and still relevant questions that he addresses, since we as Armenians and as people of defenders of human rights are far from having found the solutions to the problems of living under the threat of being dispossessed of one's language and territory. One of the first questions that Feldman and Laub address in their book is the relation between the act of witnessing and testifying and the act of reading and writing. In considering the Holocaust as their point of reference from which they draw their theoretical formulations, Feldman and Loeb introduce an innovative conception of the meaning of testimony. They posit that the act of bearing witness so that the truth may emerge, or rather re-emerge, can be rendered possible through various disciplines, allowing for cultural and artistic productions to engage with the historical realities of the time. The first thing to consider is the idea presented by Feldman and Loeb that a testimony by a survivor is not a complete statement nor account of what has occurred, since quite literally the notion of trauma is understood only belatedly after the event has occurred. It is the unspeakable and the unrepresentable. It is something which the survivor gradually becomes cognizant of. So when listening to a testimony, what should be acknowledged? Although in the judicial sense, it must hold empirical value in the court of law, Feldman and Loeb argue that a testimony not only makes claims to pre-given facts that is possessed by the testifier, but that the very speech act of testifying gives rise to the truth. They claim that this revelation of truth occurring during the speech process of the declaration and the granting of the possibility to testify in the first place become an event in their own right. We can see how creating an addressee to whom we can transmit our experience becomes an important part in the testimony process. Feldman and Loeb analyze testimony based upon three dimensions, which they characterize as the clinical, historical, and poetical. From a clinical standpoint, much like in psychiatric therapy, a testimony acts as a medium of healing to trauma, which requires for there to be a listening subject. The historical dimension suggests that although a testifier might be stating what has occurred in time, the very testimony itself becomes a historical event. Through the speech act, the testifier reclaims their lived experience. They are not necessarily testifying to historical facts, but rather testifying to survival as well. Lastly, the poetical dimension is linked to language itself. A testimony is a narrative whose language resembles that of poetry and is a form of poetic justice against the perpetrators. Feldman even goes on to problematize the notion of testifying. She questions what it means to be unable to testify, as well as to not have a witness. So what does she mean by being unable to testify? I think we would all agree that when a group of people are experiencing an event such as a genocide or ethnic cleansing, the perpetrator's intent or mission is to exterminate and dehumanize the victims and render them invisible in all realms of existence. From this perspective, Feldman calls the Holocaust an event without a witness. So if the victims are left to perish, who shall do the testifying and speak the truth on their behalf? To elaborate on this problem, she alludes to Albert Camus' The Fall, written in 1956. The Fall tells a story of a former defense lawyer who recounts his life to a stranger in a confessional manner about certain incidents of his past. One event which seems to perpetually haunt him is his witnessing of a woman's suicide. Instead of stopping to acknowledge the occurrence, he silently walks away and informs no one of the tragedy. In Feldman's analysis, The Fall represents an allegorical story of the way Holocaust history was controlled and disregarded, and the bystanders muzzled at the time of its occurrence. I quote Feldman: "The narrator of The Fall reflects indeed at once upon how history is made by and rewritten through the silence of a censor, and how massacres historically repeat themselves." End quote. Unfortunately, the statement holds true also for the Armenian genocide, as well as the recent Artsakh war. As the world silently watched the war unravel and in the process failed to hold Azerbaijan accountable for the atrocious war crimes perpetrated towards innocent civilians and military personnel, Azerbaijan, with its massive state-sponsored propaganda, attempted to control the narrative as well as defend and justify their unlawful actions. For this reason, we commend CFTJ's extraordinary undertaking in establishing an organization which gets us one step closer to denouncing injustice. By granting the war survivors the opportunity to testify, we allow for their stories to be heard, to raise awareness and acknowledge the failures and willful ignorance of contemporary politics and media, along with opening the way for healing and recovery. I would now like to turn your attention to Nikolai Sarafyan's poetic prose, written 2 years after World War II. Sarafyan was born in 1902 on a ship headed towards from Constantinople to Varna, Bulgaria, a place where his parents found refuge following the Hamidian massacres. During his childhood in Varna, he attended the Armenian primary school, as well as St. Michael's Brothers School, where he acquired French. At the onset of World War I, Sarafyan, for a period of 2 years, traveled from Bessarabia to the Crimea and settled in Constantinople in 1919, only to flee to France in 1923 during the persecutions of the Kemalist regime. Having studied at Gendronakan School while in Constantinople, where he received education from the acclaimed literary figures Hagop Oshakan and Vahan Tekeyan, Sarafyan pursued writing and made publications over the course of 6 decades. In his 1947 prose entitled The Blood of Vansan, or in its original Armenian title, Vanseni Antarab, the literary work which I will be focusing on today, Sarafyan reflects upon what the writer and filmmaker Christopher Atamian calls the psychology of dislocation. Deeply impacted by the personal and collective experiences of exile, genocide, and war, Sarafyan's philosophical treatise testifies to the psychological unease of a refugee who struggles to understand his internal and external world, both on a personal and collective level. As the anonymous narrator strolls around the Parisian park above the Vincennes during his commute to work, he relentlessly meditates on the complexities of human existence in an attempt to decipher his tragic fate and that of his native people. Before presenting some of the thematics that Sarafyan tackles in the text, which, quoting Ara Sanjian, Associate Professor of History at the University of Michigan Dearborn, is widely acclaimed as one of the most important texts of 20th century Armenian diaspora or diasporic literature, it is important to note the particular political circumstance that Sarafyan faced. Much like his male compatriots who fled to France from Constantinople during the turbulent years of the early 1920s to ensure survival, Sarafyan, upon his arrival, received a passport marked with the statement, "No return possible." We can begin to imagine the horrendous consequences of this restriction. Leaving behind their families back home in the most uncertain conditions, they had to confront a new foreign world. It is in this light that a group of young Armenian writers from this generation soon gathered in Paris to form the literary group Menk in order to, through their literary production, make sense of what had befallen upon them. Writer and literary critic Grigor Beledian writes, "This is a literature of survivors, written for survivors of a catastrophe, a deterritorialized literature born against the backdrop of a catastrophe and hence definable as post-catastrophic. It tells a story of the Armenian experience of being a foreigner living in exile through the lives of those who experienced these events. Thus, it introduces a vision of the foreign world and a more or less thematic conception of the self, which must be elucidated. But this diasporan experience to which literature is a privileged witness is of interest to anyone who has been uprooted this century by a whole host of disasters and sent on the road of exile with no way of ever returning home," end quote. I would now like to discuss some of the important themes that are highlighted in the Blood of Vincennes and connect it back to Feldman and Love's theoretical findings on testimony. What I find unique about Sarafyan's work is both its specificity and universality about human experiences. If one is to be completely ignorant of the historical context of its genesis, within it, they would discover a book embellished with imagery and personification depicting themes of doubt, hope, love, childhood, innocence, corruption, which are common to all men. On the other hand, I believe Sarafyan had an even more compelling story to share with his peers, one which involved his personal trajectory. Perpetually unsettled by his divided identity due to the violent confrontation with the West during his early adulthood, and of course the persecutions prior to his migration, Sarafyan, throughout his literary career, attempted to assert himself and find purpose in his work as a writer. The Blood of Vincennes is a reflection of this continuous struggle. I believe that through his poetic language, he attempts to testify to his and his people's survival. Barred from ever returning back home, Sarafyan had to find a spiritual homeland from where he could never be evicted. He could neither renounce his heritage nor fully integrate within French society. In order to depict his conflictual reality, the Babayan narrator envisions the park in which he regularly meanders to be a bewitching place that both comforts and torments him. In the very first section of the text, he even calls the park a tribunal, where he is to, quoting Sarafyan, tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Despite the poetics of the writing, it would be appropriate to claim that Sarafyan intended to bring to life a whole set of emotions that he himself endured as a result of his past. As the narrator nostalgically reflects upon his memories and homeland, he is overcome by the sadness that he has nowhere to lay down his roots. Insomnia, anxiety, pain of the mass killings endured by Armenians, and even thoughts of committing suicide. He writes, "When will our soul progress overcome evil and compensate for the loss of our childhood bliss, which it rips away from us as if it were some wretched thing? I'm tired and miserable. When will we salute a human justice come to us from across the oceans? When will I witness a city of reason built upon my forefathers' lands, the only one possible now, one that avoids the pitfalls of independence, when the brotherhood of peoples will rule over us? Homeless and alone, I would like nothing more than to find a homeland that measures up to my dreams. And when will I finally set about the task of building this home, this web of reason where logic will hold sway? When will I find the proper words to celebrate the fact that my tortured people, after being a victim for centuries of its own self-image, has finally become wise? I am alone as life mocks, persecutes, and reduces me to nothingness. But still, I resist. And this nothingness grows at my expense, developing and increasing steadily with every new generation." Although a diasporan, the narrator is preoccupied with the future of Armenia and implores for justice. He even goes on to say, "What is the use of living as long as our sorrows aren't avenged?" Another major concern for Sarafyan was the safeguarding of the Armenian language in a foreign country, a language which he claims is on the verge of dying. And it is still true today that Western Armenian is in fact an endangered language. For the purpose of saving the language, it was a conscious decision of the majority of the Menk writers to produce their works in Armenian rather than in French. Lastly, I would like to share an excerpt from the text which I think resonates with the political situation of current-day Armenia and Artsakh. In this excerpt, Sarafyan recalls scenes of World War II as he's reflecting upon the evils of war and political corruption. He writes, "Wild beasts were right to fear men, for over the centuries, alas, they developed death machines that could one day blow up the entire planet. My eyes weren't deceiving me. What miracles science could achieve if it used its discoveries for the greater good. As I watched in hiding from a culvert, I couldn't help but think that small nations such as ours could no longer hope to be free. The century of the great powers was beginning, and the world was headed toward a catastrophic end if these nations didn't find a way to get along. It would have been even better if one of them had proclaimed a universal nation, or perhaps a federation that united all nations so that man's soul could finally be at peace. Small nations would have their proper place as well. I was witnessing the apocalyptic dawning of a new century of scientific and political monsters. This occupied country where I now lived had fallen prey to one of them. And my own small people, who had tried for centuries to lift themselves up, only to be beaten back down each time, were anxiety-ridden because from now on, they would have to live at the mercy of stronger nations and renounce all traditional notions of patriotism and independence. And today, I blame them all, now that I understand that these nations were all founded on these types of crimes. They're all guilty of desire to conquer and subjugate other people until, little by little, they too lose their greatness and collapse from their own wastefulness and debauchery. Guilty, all of the dictators and all of the political and religious truths that fade after having left victims left behind to make room for new truths. And my eyes fill with tears as I look out at the meadows reddened with the blood of those who were duped, who were foolish and naive, as the trees teeter back and forth like the trays on a scale. Every war, every revolution deceitfully promises to be the last. And the one who sees through the dishonesty of these promises also foresees future wars. Neither faith nor hope can take root inside him. And this sadness and pity turns to anger because of this absurdity which most men openly accept, And so on that day, I realized that my people had been the least absurd of all. They had suffered from all of these stupidities and achieved a type of sainthood. They hadn't dreamed of conquest, and they had even felt empathy and sadness in their few victories. Although small and unsung, for centuries they had been the apostles of the one and only truth, the brotherhood of all men. And seeing that they had suffered because of this mission, that they had been deceived and massacred because of their sincere and naive impulses, a protest began to grow within me, a passion for justice, a sorrow that progressively transformed itself into the most cruel indignation. End quote. It is truly unfortunate that even in the 21st century, the Armenian people remain subjugated by dictators and political monsters. The cycle of war, terror, and displacement has not ceased to exist in our reality. We continue to have to face the same struggles that Sarafyan and his whole generation endured. In the blood of Ansan, through his poetic language, he testifies to the trials and tribulations of exile, and of course, to the faith of the Armenian people. What I find unique about Sarafyan's poetic language is its power. Each sentence, in a labyrinth-like manner, takes the reader on a journey to its vacillating inner consciousness. And most importantly, what I find inspiring in Sarafyan was his will to transcend the shortcomings of his destiny. He did not retreat, renounce, nor blindly have trust and faith. He chose to maintain hope and attempted to find the balance between work and writing in order to elucidate the realities of his times. Thank you.
Here we go. Hi, it's very lovely to be here. Thanks so much for also allowing me to watch and listen to some of the testimonies by survivors and victims of Artsakh. And rather than going into a kind of like more theoretical explanation, I do want to start out with some testimonies. I think it is really very important to recognize that storytelling is not just about telling any kind of story. It is, as Arpi and you also mentioned, about bearing witness to atrocity from a first-person perspective, and basically without the constraints of the legal framework, where also the perpetrator perspective has to be represented. So I think this is really about storytelling, is about empowering an individual who has suffered loss, mourning, trauma, to reconstitute in the act of storytelling an agency that that has been stripped away from them by having control over the narrative, and by also showing how what has happened to them articulates a demand for justice and accountability that has not happened yet. So there is a future-oriented dimension to storytelling of a justice or accountability that is still to happen. And the question is, how do we as listeners, and I'm thinking also of storytelling as a really powerful tool for creating something like a listening or witnessing global public, how can that be harnessed in letting the world know about what has happened in Artsakh? Can we have the first testimony, please? I'm going to call our survivor Emily by, and she is located in Mesheni and talks about her displacement. So let's listen to that.
Բոլորին ճանապարհեցինք, ովքեր որ գնում էին, ու իրանց միջից էլի շատ մարդիկ հետ չեկան, այդ եղավերջին դեպքը, որ իրանք հետ օրը գնացին, հետ չեկան, որից մեկն էին քերիներ, շատ խուլ բոլոր ճանապարհեց, ու հետ չեկան, Համբետ Գրիգորյանն էին քերիս, այնքան Ջաբրայիլում աղել մինչև վերջ ամսի հոկտեմբերի 12-ին իրան խփել են, բայց իրան Խողարկավորել ենք, ես վերջերս իր աճուրն մեզ տվել, ես վերջերս ենք խողարկավորել, պես է չեն գտել իմ ընկերուհու ամուսինը, 3 երեխա ուներ, ինքն էլ իրան հոկտեմբերի 3-ին է խփել, էլի մինչև օրս իրան չեն է գտել, ինքը անհետ կորած է համարվում, բայց տղաները տեսել են էլի, որ իրան խփել են, իմ աղբերս էլ, հարազատ եղբայրս էլ հրաշքով փրկվել է, ու էլի հոգեբանական ծանր խնդիրներով, թևի վնասվածքով, էլի մնացած մեր գյուղի բոլոր այդ տղաները, մեկի ականջներ կտրվել, մյուսի ոտքը, իմ սանիկից ոտքներ կտրվել, հիմա ինքը հաշվանդամա ոտքն է դեռ այդ մշակման փուլում ով են ամեն ինչով, դե ամենաշատը հարազատների կորուստներ, քերից, որ շատ ենք ափսոսում քերից, կորուստը, որ մինչև հիմա չենք համակերպվում, որտեղ ինքը ինչքան գյուղերում երեխա եղել, բոլորը իրան համը քերի են ասել, ինքը մեր համար միշտ մնում է համը քերի, ինքը իրոք շատ լավ մարդ ա եղել, ինքը երեք համայնքների քարտուղարն ա եղել, բոլոր գյուղապետերի աշխատանքի ինքն էր կատարում, բոլորը իրան սիրում էին, ինքը չէր ամուսնացել, երեխաներ չուներ, բայց բոլորը երեխաներին սիրում էր, սաղի համար միշտ քաղցրավենիքներ, հունիսի 1-ին բոլոր երեխաներին տանում էր իր հաշվին ման էր տալիս, տանում ենք Ստեփանակերտ հունիսի 1-ին երեխաներին ման էինք տալիս, որ մանուկների օրներ է տորը, այդ օրը նվիրում էինք երեխաներին։ Ստեփանակերտում է կյանքը շատ ակտիվ ա եղել, շատ եմ սիրում Ստեփանակերտը, միշտ կյանքիս երազանքն ա եղել Ստեփանակերտում տուն ունենալ։
Եղերն ասեք ինչ նկատի ունեք, թե ինչ։
Եղերնը, որ 115 տարի առաջ իրանք ոչնչացրեցին մեր հայ ազգի, կարելի ասել կեսը, որ իրանք ոչնչացրեցին մեր հայության մի մեծ մաս, ոճրագործություն արեցին, բոլորին դրա բոլոր հայությանը, ոնց որ ասած, Հայաստանից դուրս հանեցին, հայաթափեցին Հայաստանը մնաց առանց հայերի, այդ մեծ ցավ այն ժամանակ, որ իրանք տվել են, որ հիմա մենք մեքենաներով ենք փախել, մենք հիմա ունեցել ենք հնարավորություն ինչ-որ բան փրկելու, բայց այն ժամանակ շատ դաժան ա եղել, ոչ մի բան չի կարողացել փրկել, մի հոդված կարդացի, որ մայրը ոնց է իր երեխային գցել գետը ու թեթևացած վազել ու հետ նայել խելագարված, ոնց է իր երեխային գցել գետը։ Այն ժամանակ շատ դաժան ա եղել ու դա էլի թուրքն ա եղել, նույն ադրբեջանցին ա եղել, նույն ձեռագիրն ա եղել, նույն նպատակն ա եղել, ոնց որ հիմա, նույն նպատակն ա եղել, իրանք հիմա նորից պատերազմը ավարտվել ա, բայց մեր համար երբեք չի ավարտվում պատերազմը, որտեղ մենք պայքարում ենք մեր
All right. So I think this is a 30-minute testimony. It is incredibly powerful. Maybe once the testimony has been published, I'd encourage folks to potentially listen to this. What I did not include at the very beginning was her describing how on the evening of September 26 at 11 p.m. The sounds of war were being heard. All of a sudden, the entire family was enveloped in a war that came upon them. And her husband then basically was bombed while working in a hydroelectrical station. He fell unconscious. He had facial burns. And the family suffered horribly. Now, one of the reasons I chose these segments is that in Emily's account of what happened here, there is a clear trajectory of repetition, a kind of like re-traumatization in which this most recent conflict is part of a larger trajectory and war of aggression, right, that has not ceased after all this time. And this is so deeply ingrained in her memory, this moment of re-victimization, right? And I wanted to share that story, that or her experience of that. We also, throughout this conference, we have also been asking what has been maybe hardest for some of the victims to experience. You know, we hear here it is the loss of her relatives, right? She's describing the uncle who got recruited. She also, in an earlier part of the interview, she talks about how immediately following the September 26 events and 27, all the boys from the village were recruited into the self-defense forces, and how for her it was completely, utterly heartbreaking and gut-wrenching to see, you know, the people from the village being killed in military action. I think it's also very interesting that in this testimonial, when she is speaking about the loss of her uncle, while this is a moment of almost intense reliving of the trauma. It is also a moment of mourning where she almost celebrates the life of her uncle. Maybe you see this change in tone. This is the only time where she actually smiles when she is recounting, she's honoring the memory of her uncle, and so this also speaks to the multiple ways in which video testimony works for the survivors, moving in and out of these very different emotions of both recounting a story, reflecting on it as she does at the very end on the Armenian genocide. So I think this is just. It's a really amazing testimony, and whoever did this, they're really supposed to be commended. I'd like to move now to a second testimonial by a military, by a reserve officer who was stationed in Jabrail, and who is basically describing in this really harrowing way how his forces were outnumbered, and basically how all the military equipment was destroyed. I just want to issue a trigger warning here. Anybody maybe who has been part of a military conflict, I don't want anybody to be re-traumatized and triggered, so please maybe you can look away or put on sunglasses. Can we have that second one, please?
Ով որ մնացել էր մոլորվել էր, տների մեջ թաքնվել էր, կարծես ուղղակի մեջ էին եղել։ Ով մնացել, գիտակցելով, որ գայնը բռնում, հասկացաք, ավելի լավ իրանք մտածել են մնան այդտեղ, ու ասենք, որին հաջողություն ա եղել, որին է չի եղել գերի։ Որն է հերել ա մարտավարը, սոկվել։ Որն է մրցել, օրինակ ես հոսպիտալում որ պարտացի շատ թրտահարություն պետքեր գրանցվեց, որ մնացել է, ու ծրտահարությունը տերմույց հետ բողնաթանքերը հեղացրել են դաշույթները, իցա դրա հետևանքնա կրվից հետո մնացել են ներել։ Մնացել են որը կեր եղել է, որը չին մնում։ Մի խոսքով մի կերպ այդ ռմբակոծության ընթացքում հերել ենք վերև։ Մեր արդեն ճիշտում արդեն կարմիր շուկա։ Այդտենց երկորով մանրամասը պատմեմ, թե չէ։ Էլի մանրամասը մի քիչ թռուցիկ եմ պատմում, չեմ կարող ջամեր գտելի, բայց ասենք իրանց համինար շատ քիչ ենք, ու իրանց տեխնիկաների համինար, օրինակ հադրութից եկել են ճանապարհի շարած իքը պայթեցրած մեր ակումներ, մեր տեխնիկաները, այդ ինչով պետք է լինի։ Կամ թրսից պետք բերեին օգնություն, կամ չգիտեմ, ես էլ այդ մանրամասը չեմ խորանում, շատ բաներ կա պատմելու չեմ պատմում, հիմնական սիտուացիան եմ պատմում, ոնց է տեսնեմ ինչ է։ Օգտովեցի ասի շատ ես կուշել եք նկարում, ինչ-որ օգտովություն է պատահելու, սենց բան չէր եղել, այդ կողմերը, որ մի քիչ խունտեղ էր, անօդաչու սարքերը քան չէին դեմ, այժմ մենք խորել ենք խրաման չէր, անհատական, մի հատ ստեղ, մի հատ ընդեղ չէր կապում իրար, հասկացան խրամատը գիտեք չեն։ Մի հատ ընդեղ, մի հատ 10 մետր ենք ում, ցենց հատիկ էլի, ամեն մեկ իրակոս։ Այդտենց ճիշտ էի մտածել, ժամը 10-ին մի հատ պայթոց եկավ մեր ծորակի մեջ։ Ու սկսեցի դրանք։ Սկսեցին հենա ասեցի իմ խմբին, մտեք փոսերը դուրս չգաք։ Մտան փոսերը ես էլ վազեցի, որ իմ փոսը մտնեմ, գնդացիրը վերցրեցի, վազեցի, այդ ժամանակ նոյեմբերի 4-ն էր, 3 մետրի վրա մինամյոտը պայթեց, 4 տարի իմ փոսի մեջ, պայթեց, ճիշտ ասած չզգացի, տակ էր, ուզեցակ ամեն ես մի ոտքես, այս փոսերը պետք լորի հետևի մուս էր, կաշին էր պահում, հետևի մասը նորը զգացի սաղարում, ուշ մի ծակ չկա, են ճիշտ ասում որ մեռնողը չի ծնվել, ոչ մի ցավ, ոչ մի բան, ոչ մի այդի շատ ճիշտ է մելի բանը, որ ասում են ինչ չի պատկերացնում, ընդհանրապես արուն եմ չէ, տակություն, տակացել է, զգացել եմ, նոր տղեկը, որ ուզում են առաջի օգնություն ցույց տան, տեսան, էս իրա, ասենք դերեցել էս հա թե հարմատից է, բան չզգացել, հետո չափել են 3 մետրից էր, 80 միլիմետրանոց, միլիմետր պայթ է, մի խոսքով էլի վտանգավոր էր մեքենատը հանելը չկարացան այս փոսից հանեն, մի հատ լավ հարուր թունել, հրամանապարությանը պատկերացրեք իմացավ չեն կարացել հանեն, փախավ, մոազով առանց հրամանին, եկավ իջավ ծոր, աղետներ ավտո չի իշնի, իջելա ծոր ինձի օգնություն են ցույց տվել, ու մի կերպ պատկերացրեք ուազ իրա պերեդո կրարկակում չկան, հրթել է անձնակացն ավտո, այդ փոսերի մեջով.
Okay, so what is really noticeable about him telling the story is that there are various points in his testimony where he says, you know, this would really take me hours to tell. I'm just going to summarize, or I can't go into all these details because it would be too horrific to tell. And whoever has done the interview, I hope they may potentially go back and actually get his full testimony rather than just having a summary. Say, right, there is this sense that whatever is being told is not the entire story, and you know, that there is so much that he either represses or cannot share or feels it's not appropriate, and maybe there can be some follow-up. It's also very interesting. This is about a 50-minute testimony. We don't learn until the very end that he is disabled, that he has lost his legs. So the way in which he's being framed on the camera, on the sofa, we only see the upper half of the body. There is no indication that he actually has been maimed and injured. There is a very important part at the beginning where he talks about, and for whatever reason we didn't get that segment, where he talks about fighting along with 18-year-olds and how the 18-year-olds were so impressive, and here they were sent on the front lines. When he describes this, how Hadrut basically had fallen and how they barely made it out, and he's talking about the kids, you know, and it's like these children. Of course, he's talking about the 18-year-olds that were left behind, and that are among those 5,000 who literally have been fallen. He barely made it out himself, but it's also a testimony to the kind of senseless deaths and killing that followed. He then, in the other segment where he describes that he and his team of only 9 would use radio communications, and in these radio communications they pretended to be 90 rather than 9 because they knew with 9 they had no chance whatsoever. I should also mention the way in which these segments were cut. They are not in one take. These are different parts of the interview. And the last one, particularly, what I find also particularly harrowing, it becomes very clear that with the mercenaries, with the drones, there is this technological advantage where the self-defenses are completely powerless, right? They may as well, you know, I don't know, I cannot comment on this, but it seems, you know, what is worth a fight for the sake of a fight, right? You just see, you know, this really horrific loss of life, and at the very end, of course, it's again the drone warfare that's going to that has already set in this completely asymmetrical power, and he describes how they dug holes to survive, but that's when he's being hit by a drone, right? And that really, in a certain way, brings home the the ethics or the non-ethics around the asymmetrical power of drone warfare and the ways in which, of course, Turkey has conducted a proxy war that, in a certain way, if we combine it with the first testimony, is a kind of like reenactment of the Armenian genocide, maybe in the 21st century, at least in the minds of Emily. So I think that moment is also important. All right, for now, we'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. Now, I'll open the floor for some questions. And if you have any questions, we have volunteers, and if you have any question, please write your question, and the volunteers will bring your question to me. So I'll start with the first question addressed to Professor Heckner. What are the most common problems you can mention in terms of proving human rights violations?
Okay. So the question is, what is the function of the storytelling, right? Clearly, there is, as you were also mentioning, medical evidence that points to the use of phosphorus, right? Other materials. There are many accounts in which survivors hold shrapnel in their hands that they have found, or describe how members of their families, where shrapnel has entered their bodies, they were rushed to the hospitals. The shrapnel is still moving around in their bodies. There are many, many accounts of that. All really harrowing, and I'm not for promoting sensationalism or goriness, but I do think it would be very important to maybe put some of these testimonials, anonymize them to show what is the impact of drone warfare, asymmetrical drone warfare on civilians. I think you were mentioning something very important that maybe we have kind of like overlooked, which is the propaganda machine. Whoever has, whoever has wins the war of propaganda wins the war. I mean, it's depressing, but that seems to be also an aspect that needs to be pushed back very strongly. In addition to collecting evidence, right, to expose the lies and the web of propaganda that has allowed this to happen. I'm also thinking of the previous panel speaker. Maybe you want to comment on that, or. Oh, okay.
Լրիությամբ ձեզ հետ համաձայն ենք, ինչ նշեցիք, շատ կարևոր է, եւ պրոպագանդայի մասով եւ ամենավտանգավորի վերաբերյալ, որ այդ հիվանդանոցների այդ ռազմական հանցագործությունների մասով հենց դա է կարևոր նպատակը, որ հավաքվի եւ without lies, առանց ստերի մենք իրականությունը կարողանանք ներկայացնել հանրությանը եւ հանրությունը իմանա զերծ պրոպագանդայից եւ այդ ռազմական հանցագործությունները կարողանան միջազգային հանրությանը օբյեկտիվ ձևով ներկայացի։ Եթե Աստղիկ ունես։
Thank you, Mrs. Heckner, for your words. It's very important for me that you speak about my topic. Thank you so much.
The next question, it's not addressed to any of the panelists, but I'll address it to Paruyr and or Astghik, because they've been doing a lot of work in this area. What do you do when there are critical witnesses who have horrific experiences to share, but don't? whether they're afraid to speak or too traumatized? How do you try to get the stories out?
We are volunteers at the Center for Trust and Justice, and we work, we contact with Artsakh people, and by this way we collect testimonies, and about this information we speak in our topics.
Եթե կարելի է մի փոքր էլ ավելացնեմ, այդ ընթացակարգ, այդ գործողությունները մենք կատարում ենք միջազգային ընդունված ընթացակարգերին համահունչ, այսինքն մենք այնպիսի հարցեր ենք տալիս, մենք այնպիսի ձևով ենք ներկայացնում, որպեսզի այն թույլատրելի լինի այդ ապացույցները, որոնք մենք հավաքում ենք եւ կարողանանք ձևավորել ճշգրիտ օբյեկտիվ իրականությունը.
Thank you. Professor Heckner, would you like to comment?
Okay, I think it always should be up to the survivors and witnesses to feel when and if they are ready to give a testimonial, right? I think we do need to respect their injury and what they have been through, and there may be a time lag, right? But it should be the survivor and witness who determines when and if they're ready. And since there is a real danger of re-traumatization, it also would be very helpful to have a psychologist or psychiatrist there, so to ensure that they're not being re-traumatized. What is interesting about some of these interviews is that the military officer seemed to be kind of almost detached from the story. He had this very monotone, I don't know, maybe he was taking, maybe he's in treatment or so, but he had this very monotone way of telling the story, which in and of itself could also be a coping mechanism of self-numbing, right? What happens to the entire spectrum of emotional, whereas Emily, she went through the entire range of emotions, from tears, mourning, testimony, reflection, right? And that is very different, right? So I think we also want to be sensitive to the tone of the conversation.
Thank you. The next question, the person who asked the questions has written a note for me saying that the question is for Professor Heckner or Arpi, but since let's start with Arpi if she has any thoughts on this. So the question is, in your experience, what is the time frame that memory tends to fade? If not possible to get testimonies immediately, what is the absolute latest time frame to ensure decently accurate testimony? Any thoughts on this, Arpi?
So when
Did you get
memory fades?
Yeah. So when the memory, so what do you think the memory? How fresh should the testimony be? How far can the person taking the testimony go?
I think that I would say that it doesn't matter. Whenever, as Professor Heckner stated, whenever the survivor is ready to testify to their trauma, as I had mentioned earlier, the very process of narrating and speaking out on trauma, it occurs belatedly after the event. So it's something that occurs over an extended period of time. And it's something that the listener of the trauma has to be patient with the testifier. And regarding cultural productions, I mean, I think it would be stating the obvious that across periods of times, we have had people testifying to events that have occurred over the course of history. So it would be difficult to say when it would be too early or too late to testify to trauma or a specific event in time.
Thank you, Arpi. Professor?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to emphasize that testimonials are not just for the purposes of evidence gathering and witnessing in the courtroom. That's, I guess, one of the functions. I think the other one is, modality of what does it mean to be forming a story, a coherent story about an event that happened in the past with, as I said, demands of accountability and justice, and to what degree is this a narrative that empowers him, her, or him, the subject that is articulating that. I think we should also consider how the ability to reconstitute one's life and identity maybe starts with being able to tell a story about what happened and where to move on from there. And I understand that some of these testimonies, especially the interviewers, really stress the dimension of the future. So I think the moment of the future oriented as a moment of reckoning, justice, but also a life that can be reclaimed is very important. And I think it's also very important to recognize that this, survivor stories cannot just be about survival or bare survival, right? This is about reclaiming the dignity and quality of life in conjunction with maybe medical services or material assistance, et cetera, et cetera. Just very briefly on the issue of memory, we know, very often eyewitness accounts can differ. Memory is a kind of like a force field where, with the passage of times, sort of like it's memory very often, especially after the event, is not necessarily a kind of like photographic memory, right? Very often memory shifts. If memory, there are discourses, for instance, on the to do with, I work on the question of tattooing and facial tattooing during the Armenian genocide, and if some of the women who were interviewed clearly came up with stories that didn't match up to what happened. And so you, on the one hand, you have the subjective truth of survivor memory. And I think it is very important to respect that, even if it does not necessarily match up to perceived objective history, right? So we also need to keep in mind the different workings of memory beyond the evidentiary.
So I have two questions here from Garine, who I met the other day. She's from Argentina. And she has one question for Paruyr and Astghik, and another question for Professor Heckner and Arpi. So I'll ask the question addressed to Paruyr and Astghik first. What was the most difficult part of interviewing the victims of Artsakh?
Difficult part is when they start to cry, and I start to cry too, and it's very difficult.
Ավելացնելով, այո, ամենադժվար մասը դա հոգեբանական վիճակն է, որովհետև ես էլ Աստղիկն էլ լինելով Արցախցի, մենք ականատես ենք եղել այդ իրադարձություններին, եւ այդ հոգեբանական վիճակն է, որ դու պետք է կարողանաս հաղթահարել, եւ եթե դու ընկնում ես հոգեբանական տրավմայի մեջ, քո կարող է հավաքած նյութերը օբյեկտիվ չլինեն, եւ դու պետք է ամեն ձև կարողանաս, դա է ամենամեծ դժվարությունը, հաղթահարել այդ հոգեբանական ասպեկտը եւ կարողանալ շարունակել հարցազրույցը եւ հավաքել ապացույցները.
Now the question to address to Arpi and Dr. Hechner is, considering all that the Armenian people have lived through, do you think that one day the victims of the war will be able to heal their psychological wounds? Do you think that getting justice could help heal those traumas? Arpi, you want to start?
Sure. Will they heal? I think that's a that could be answered from a case-to-case basis. But I think that looking at it from cultural productions, I think allowing to give a testimony and engaging in the speech process of testifying becomes a process of healing and reconciling with the past. So I believe that as long as they are granted the opportunity to testify, then that could get them one step closer to healing. But I think healing, it would be hard to say that it can be conclusive and they can ultimately heal, but we would hope that.
Thank you. Professor?
It is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to come back from trauma, and we need to realize that. So especially, it depends on whether maybe you're a displaced person, whether you lost your home, is your family still alive, can you reconstitute your life? It's also very interesting. Emily talks about moving to Garni and living in a house that reminds her of her old home, and it becomes her old home, and what that means psychologically. But this is very different for, let's say, POWs and victims of torture who have undergone, serious traumatic events. And, in a certain way, when I said survival or bare survival is not enough, they are, even if they have survived, at severe risk of suicide and need medical intervention services. And I sort of would kind of hope that there is a nexus between the legal and the medical profession, that then, I guess they have a right to care, to medical care, to ensure that they can start reclaiming their lives. And that is an incredibly difficult enterprise. So yes, while we would hope that coming back from trauma is possible, it is a long process, and not everybody will succeed, and all resources should be, made available. And I should also mention, maybe, there are low-cost ways of addressing PTSD. I'm just thinking of some, US-based initiatives where actually service dogs, for folks who have severe anxiety disorder. Or, there are many strategies that are low cost and effective, but it strikes me there needs to be intensive follow-up.
Although we can talk about this topic, about storytelling, and actually tell the stories, but unfortunately I have to sum up the panel and thank our panelists, Dr. Heckner, Arpi, Astghik, Paruyr. You were amazing in your presentations. Thank you so much, and thank you for the questions.